This is a follow-up to my White Sharia video because this topic came up in the comments, and so I wanted to address it separately. And that's the subject of polygamy versus monogamy. And this is one of the main differences between Sharia and White Sharia. So Sharia is polygamous. It endorses and encourages one man having up to 4 wives. And the European practice, in contrast, has been much more nearly monogamous for a very long time, thousands of years. Tacitus is writing about the Germans being nearly monogamous, with the exception of a few aristocratic families 2,000 years ago. And monogamy was, I believe, the Greco-Roman norm as well, with, some debauchery and degeneracy thrown in. So it's a very old difference, it's a very old distinction, and what you have are some trade-offs made in different ways by Islamic and Western societies. And I think we got the better of the deal. We got the better mix of costs and benefits. And I'm going to explain why. So, I will admit, first of all, that as a male, polygamy sounds intuitively pretty appealing. And the argument has even been made that polygamy must be more eugenic than monogamy. Because, if you think about it, if you have a system that permits one man to have multiple wives, then you're going to end up with a case where a few guys at the top are going to end up with most of the women. And that means those guys at the top have much more reproductive success under polygamy than they would have under monogamy. So you would think it would tend to pass on their traits, because presumably those are going to be your top guys, your best guys, your highest quality guys. And if they're having all of the offspring, or very nearly all of the offspring, then that should be eugenic. Well, okay, it's a pretty intuitive argument. Makes a lot of sense. But if you actually look at the places where polygamy has been practiced, the Middle East and Africa, you don't see a lot of evidence of eugenic outcomes. You don't see a lot of signs of eugenia. You don't see a lot of accumulated eugenic capital. So, what's going on? Well, one thing that could be going on is that, yes, the top guys are being reproductively more successful in terms of absolute numbers. They have more mates, they have more children. But there's also more intense competition for mates. So, all of the top guys can't all have harems of top quality women. There's just not enough to go around. So they're having to marry down. They're having to marry women of lower socioeconomic status, of lower genetic quality, etc. And so, yes, they're having more mates and more children, but they're also lower quality mates and lower quality children. These women aren't necessarily the best women to be transmitting the elite traits that allowed these guys, in particular, to rise to the top of the male status hierarchy in their country or their nation. So that's one thing that could be going on. The other thing is, if you look at the female side of the equation instead of just the male, the case is a lot weaker for eugenia and a lot stronger for dysgenia. So, evolution occurs by differential survival and reproduction. In this case, we're looking at differential reproduction. And that means, in order for there to be a differential in reproduction and reproductive success, some people have to be not meeting their reproductive potential. Their actual reproductive capacity has to be less than the potential, because that's where your differentials coming from. But Islamic customs seem to maximize reproduction across the board. Well, that doesn't set up a differential, so it doesn't have a eugenic effect. And in a polygamous system where women can marry up fairly easily because men have to marry down, even fairly low quality women can obtain pretty high degree of reproductive success. Their actual reproduction can pretty closely match their potential. So, yes, you're giving guys more reproductive success in terms of quantity, if not quality, but you're also giving the lowest quality women more reproductive success by giving them access to the genes and to the resources of higher quality men. Now, in contrast, in Europe, where there were a lot of eugenic customs in place, like the requirement that a man have his own home before he could marry, you had certain men excluded from reproduction because they didn't meet the minimum necessary requirements. And in a monogamous system, if you exclude a certain portion of the men from reproduction, you're almost necessarily excluding a similar proportion of women because once all the marriageable, eligible males are paired up, there's going to be some males left over who are excluded from that, and that means there are going to be some women left over who don't get to reproduce either. So, if you have those eugenic standards, like the requirement that a man own his own home before marriage and reproduction, then, if you're excluding some men from reproduction, you're going to be excluding a similar number of women, right? Because there are going to be some lower quality women left over once all the eligible men have been married. And once all the higher quality women have married all the eligible men. So that's part of your differential right there. But there were also, there was also a more or less continuous increase in reproductive fitness towards the top of the socioeconomic or quality scale. And there were a variety of ways in which that took place. But I mean, mainly, your medium quality women who are marrying ordinary guys, they still have the opportunity to reproduce, but they don't have access to the resources that the highest quality women with access to the highest quality guys have. So, the resource thing was big. If you have more resources, more of your children survive. More food, more medicine, etc. And you can afford more children and more of them survive. So there's and there's other things too, like I think in one of my previous videos I mentioned the wet nurse thing, right? So if you're a rich woman hiring a wet nurse, you can go back to having children sooner because you spend less time lactating. And meanwhile, the poor woman who you hire to nurse your children has fewer children, and because she spends more time lactating, right? So there are a variety of ways in which there was a continuous increase in reproductive success towards the top of the genetic scale or the socioeconomic scale on both the male and female side. And so you get strong differential reproduction and then strong eugenic selection to go along with it. Well, you don't have that under polygamy. You have it on the male side, but not the female side. And even on the male side, the eugenic effect is watered down by the fact that the male has to marry down in order to find a mate in most cases, because there's more intense competition for mates. So, if you look at the empirical evidence, if you look at the places where this has actually been practiced, it seems like the dysgenic effects probably outweigh the eugenic ones. That just seems to be the way it is. And, in addition to these effects, there are others. There's military implications. There are cultural, social, political implications, economic implications. Basically, what you end up with in these polygamous societies is you have a lot of young, single, desperate males who have essentially no reproductive prospects, no reproductive outlets, and young unmarried males are the source of most of your social problems, your crime, your violence, your rape, stuff like that. And in addition to that, they're, a possible source of instability and revolt, because if they essentially have no prospects, then, hey, why not knock off the guys on top and take their spots and take their shit and take their women, right? If you got nothing to lose, why not risk it? So traditionally what these societies have done is cut these guys loose and turn them loose on others. And so Islamic societies can belch forth a large conquering horde of desperate, expendable, low-quality males every so often. And that's an extremely effective strategy. And, the mythology of the 72 virgins and stuff just plays right into it. They're basically telling these guys, hey, don't kill us and take our women. Go kill those other guys and take their women. And if you die, you get even more women. So it's like no-lose situation. And what do you have to lose anyway? So why not? Brilliant. It's brilliant. But in contrast, Western societies have tended to produce fewer numbers of higher quality warriors, higher investment, with a more productive economy behind them, with higher technology, more training, etc., etc. And these are heroes, conquering heroes, who are not expendable, but they're in it to win it. And, that can be an effective strategy too, especially if, as was previously the case, we would play our strengths against their weaknesses and not allow them to do that to us. So, maybe there's a deficiency there to be addressed, and maybe it would be a good thing to have the expendable suicide squads, but I think we can probably address that in another way, and that is to encourage the old to fill that role. Because, the less life you have left, the less you're giving up by throwing years away. So, when people start nearing the end of their useful life, maybe we could encourage them to go out with honor and dignity in a way that serves their progeny and their kin instead of burdening them. Just a thought. But maybe a worthwhile one. And then you have, the economic case, too. Because, in addition to having these desperate, violent, frustrated young males around in a polygamous society that you have to figure out what to do with, you're also not incentivizing them to produce economically. Maybe you're incentivizing them to take big risks, to risk it all and, get rich and die trying, that sort of thing. To try and take a gamble, basically, a desperate gamble, to make it into that top 20% that have some reproductive prospects, or have good reproductive prospects. And, barring that, to lose everything. So, you're incentivizing extremely risky behavior, but you're not necessarily incentivizing people to be productive, conscientious, stable, reliable, productive, concerned citizens, invested in the future of the society, or the children. And that's something that Western civilization does really well for like our medium quality guys, by giving them a stake in the society and in the future through marriage and family and children. And that incentivizes them to be not only good citizens and reliable and trustworthy and all that, conscientious, but also economically fairly productive. And married men are much more productive than unmarried men by about 44%. And this is something that doesn't appear to be a selection effect, because it happens in shotgun marriages as well. The male gets much more productive after marriage. And so that's that's one way in which the West has handily exceeded Islam, because of our monogamous customs. And so there are all sorts of trade-offs. I just think we're kind of lucked into the better trade-offs, and we shouldn't squander those advantages.